Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach, and in this short audio presentation, we're going to talk about failure. So what is failure? Well, in traditional management, and I'm afraid sometimes in education, failure is something to be avoided. It's an indication that you've done something wrong. It's a setback that means you're going to have to go and redo something. It can be a permanent mark or stigma that follows you around. And, worst of all, it might be a prediction of personal failure. But in entrepreneurship, and as most educational researchers and psychologists are now beginning to acknowledge, failure can also be something completely different. First, it's inevitable. In other words, you can't avoid failure across the span of your entire life. Everyone makes mistakes. No one does everything right perfectly the first time. Failure is an opportunity to gain valuable information about yourself and the world around you. Failure is an opportunity to build new skills, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Failure is an opportunity to be vulnerable, and I appreciate that this is a really tough one for all of us. It's hard to let other people know you've made a mistake, that you screwed up. But letting other people know, being vulnerable, allows other people to acknowledge that they've also made mistakes. And that creates an opportunity for all of us to learn new things, both individually and together. Failure is an opportunity to stay on a path that can only be found by trial and error. If you think back to our last audio presentation, you'll remember that we talked a little bit about this idea that entrepreneurship is always something slightly new. And so it's not always possible to predict in advance what's going to work. You have to try something. And if it works, great. But a lot of times you're going to try things that don't work because there was no way to know. And so trying things and having them not work out perfectly shows you where you need to be when you're on this kind of path, where it is the only way to find out where the path actually is. And failure is an opportunity to be right and hopefully successful soon. The reality is that the entrepreneurial and business world is filled with failures that led to successes. James Dyson built more than 5,000 prototypes before he developed the vacuum cleaner technology that led to the Dyson company that I'm sure you've seen. Sean Parker co-founded Napster, which was sued out of existence basically in 2001. Then he co-founded Plaxo and was forced out by his investors just a few years later. And all of that happened just in time to fully understand how the digital world was evolving, such that when he was introduced to Facebook, which at the time was still the Facebook and was only available on certain college campuses, he saw what it was going to be. He saw the enormous potential that this type of social media platform had, and he became the founding president of Facebook. In 2005, Drew Houston was traveling, and he forgot his USB stick that had all of the key files on it that he needed. And later that year, he created the software that became Dropbox because he never wanted that to happen again. Basically led the revolution in file sharing platforms. And maybe one of the most famous examples of all time, Apple Computer, and I know you know who that is. Apple Computer founder and CEO Steve Jobs was fired by his own board of directors in 1985. And I want to share with you what he said about that years and years later. He said, "I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter into one of the most creative periods of my life. And I hope that as you think about entrepreneurship, you acknowledge the reality that in entrepreneurial activity and almost any other activity, some amount of failure is inevitable. And the more you can see it as an opportunity to learn, I think the more you will gain, the more successful you will be. And failure is inevitable in the entrepreneurial world. In the United States, almost 600,000 new companies are formed every single year, and 40 to 60% of them will close within 4 to 5 years. Now, that's still a lot lower than the numbers you often see in the mass media, where people will say something like, and I've heard this even in places like TEDx talks and articles from substantive business publications like the Wall Street Journal, where they'll say, 80% of all startups fail. That's just fundamentally not true. The statistics clearly show that, the failure rate's reasonably high, but it's about 50% over 4 to 5 years. Now, there are types of companies that tend to fail at a higher rate. Venture capital-backed growth companies generally have a higher failure rate than that. But there's a lot of reasons that that is the case. Those kinds of companies have to either grow very, very fast, or their investors will want to shut them down as quickly as possible. In addition, it's really important to remember that as much as you hear about these kinds of companies, and yes, they're exciting and sexy and everybody wants to raise millions of dollars and so on and so forth, remember that less than 1% of all U.S. ventures will raise venture capital. Less than 1 out of 100 companies, in reality the numbers are probably even smaller than that, will ever raise professional venture capital. So yes, the failure rates are high and you need to be prepared for them, but be aware that they're probably not as high as what you might hear in the mass media. So how do you deal with failure? If you want to be an entrepreneur, or even just to have an entrepreneurial mindset, you need to be prepared to deal with failure. And I'd ask you right now, take a moment. I'm going to just be quiet in just a second here. Take a moment and think about, when was the last time you failed? Maybe you forgot to turn in an assignment. Maybe you were supposed to call someone back. Maybe you should have written a thank you note. Maybe you didn't do something very well, or you had a project that didn't go well, or you just got something wrong, or you let you were the goalie and you let someone score a goal on you. But take a moment here and think about the last time you experienced failure and how you dealt with it. What came into your mind? What sort of scenario? And how did it affect you? How powerful were the emotions associated with failing? Did you just soldier on and sort the problem out? Did you take time to think of alternatives, or did you just try to pretend like it didn't happen at all? Failure is inevitable, especially in new and unfamiliar activities. Let me ask you a question. How did you learn to ride a bike? My guess is the vast majority of students in my courses know how to ride a bicycle. When you were a few years old, did your parents give you a physics lesson with moments of inertia and torque and all the aspects of angular momentum? Is that how you learned to ride a bicycle? Or did you learn to ride a bicycle by having someone, probably an adult, put you on a bike, maybe with training wheels, maybe not, and then walk or run alongside you while you began pedaling? Some things have to be learned, are best learned experientially. Riding a bike is probably one of them. And I think entrepreneurship is also something where you can learn a lot about it, but you'll also learn by doing it. And that means falling down once in a while. Here's another example. How about SpaceX, one of the most exciting new technology companies in the entire world, building reusable rockets to change the entire way we think about going to space. And SpaceX experiences failure all the time. And so this video was published on YouTube called How Not to Land an Orbital Rocket Booster. I'm going to just start it for a moment here to see how it goes. And I've put the link down here that I encourage you. It's only a 2-minute long video, but I'd strongly encourage you to consider watching this video when you have time. Because basically, it's an opportunity to see all the things that went wrong as they were trying to get this technology of reusing the rocket boosters. So I think you get the idea. Keep in mind that this was published by SpaceX. This is not some critic or some business consultant or professor trying to make a point about how terrible the company is. This is the company publishing their own YouTube video on all the things that went wrong, because they're recognized, Elon Musk recognized, to his credit, that failure was inevitable and that they needed to be able to learn from it. They had to recognize it as just part of the process. Embracing failure as a stepping stone to success is a key aspect of entrepreneurship. Acknowledge your own mistakes, recognize what can be learned from them, and use failure as a guide to build your skills. Only those who dare to fail greatly can ever achieve greatly. And I hope that over the course of the semester, you'll embrace this and think about it. Yes, I want you to do well in the class. Yes, you should ace the quizzes and the exams. And I understand we have to do grades and things like that. But in the experiential side of the entrepreneurial things that you're going to actually practice this semester, allow yourself to get things wrong and to fix them and to learn from them. I'd strongly encourage you to learn more about this. This is very closely related to the ideas of a fixed and growth mindset. The idea that some people have a mindset that's very fixed, that they're simply focused on one goal. Maybe it's getting 100 on a test. Maybe it's finishing this assignment. Maybe it's getting a certain type of job, whatever it happens to be, versus a growth mindset where you're constantly focused on the learning itself and what you can gain from that throughout your life. And one of the leaders of this movement in this field is Carol Dweck, who's a Stanford professor. And there's a wonderful TED Talk that I'd encourage you to watch. And you can click on the links on the presentation. And you might be interested to know that there is some evidence out there that students who use this sort of growth mindset do tend to get better grades. And so something that you might want to ponder as we continue to learn about entrepreneurship and think about how entrepreneurship can be relevant to our own lives.